I'm Fionnuala Ní Éileáin. I'm a professor of law, but also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. And I'm really delighted to be able to moderate this important session that's looking at the question of sunsetting emergency powers in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we're all aware as we join this session today that the outbreak of the pandemic has stretched state capacity across the world. It has simultaneously revealed both the robustness and the fragility of public health, education, economics and transport, our legal systems and our security systems. And so in one sense, the pandemic is a classic emergency, a sudden and unexpected event that challenges all of the capacities of states and whose multifaceted manifestations have crippled the capacities of health systems to function. But as we all know, there's been no exceptional or lack of exceptional responses to this pandemic. We've seen the physical lockdown of millions of people, mandates to return millions from rural communities from cities. We've seen restrictions on expression that challenge government management of the crisis, so-called fake news challenges, mandatory labor productions, data tracking on millions of people, extensive deep border controls, and a broad range of political and legal controls that are far-reaching and function both at the wholesale and the retail level. So this session today is really about looking at the scale of the challenges that we're facing across the globe. We're thinking about and assessing the scale, the impact and the long-term significance of emergency powers and trying better to understand them and also to think about how we're going to end their use given the challenges they pose to the rule of law, to democracy, to transparency and to accountability. So I'm really delighted to be joined by this extraordinary panel of experts, individuals who come from international organizations, from private philanthropy, to think about the practical challenges of how we bring emergency powers to an end, how we sunset them. And so let me introduce my speakers before we're going to jump and dive right into this conversation. The first is Thomas Carruthers, who's the interim president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The second is Joe Powell, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Open Government Partnership. And the third is Emily Martinez, the Program Director of the Human Rights Initiative at the Open Society Foundations. So we're going to start by asking you all maybe to reflect on one central question. And I was going to start with you, Tom, if that's okay, to ask you to think about this question that, you know, we know that almost, well, it's now over 5 million people have died worldwide from COVID since the very start of this pandemic last March 2 years ago. And so the crisis has demanded the adoption of these extraordinary responses. And there's also in parallel to that real great alarm over the scope and impact of these powers, as I've identified. So what do you think, Tom, when you stop and see this array of powers being used across the world, what do you see as the risk posed by those powers? And what are the impact of them? What concerns you the most?
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you here. In the many states of emergency that have been passed around the world in the last year and a half, and it's over 100 countries that have put in place states of emergency relating to the pandemic, there are 4 main areas that have really created serious problems for civil society. The first are blanket bans on public gatherings. Over 150 countries have imposed bans on public gatherings. And this comes right at the moment when the world is experiencing an enormous wave of protests. And so this ban on public gatherings of any type has really hit civil society hard. The second are stepped up penalties on information usage, particularly, quote, misinformation, which is easily abused by authorities who want to use such powers to crack down on civil society. Third are enhanced surveillance measures, which are used as part of the pandemic response, but which open the door to a kind of tracking of citizens that has never existed before in a number of countries. And then fourth is the delay of elections in many countries, which shuts down the space for campaigning, but for open discussion of ideas generally. And so it is really all of these measures have a validity as part of a pandemic response, but all of them are easily abused if a government wants to do so, to target specific groups, specific individuals, to overstate the importance of these measures and to, misuse them in some serious ways, which unfortunately we've seen in many countries. And I think the path away from such measures shouldn't be thought of as an on and off switch. It's not like we're expecting to say, hey, countries just turn off the emergency powers switch, go back to normal. That's obviously not feasible. I think it's important instead to focus on what's a healthy process around these measures that can lead to a gradual stepping away or a quicker stepping away when possible. By process, I mean the following. Governments need to allow oversight of these measures, parliamentary discussion and review. They need to allow citizen input into these measures through as simple a measure like Taiwan has done with allowing press conferences in which citizen groups can pose searching questions to government officials about the measures. It also means transparency of information about the measures. If you have these kind of basic elements that accompany the emergency measures, then civil society is able to do three key things which it needs to do to keep these measures proportionate and reasonable. First, it allows civic groups to monitor the measures, and we've seen, for example, in Pakistan or Nepal, really excellent monitoring measures undertaken by civic groups of emergency powers. It allows citizens groups to advocate for reasonableness and proportionality in the measures. And third, it allows citizen groups to pursue legal action when needed. And so if you create a balanced process in which governments establish the kinds of mechanisms that create the avenue for input, transparency, oversight, give civil society the chance to play its role, then you can begin to see a walking away from measures in a reasonable way. Because what we don't want to do as a community concerned about civic space is to sound like we're reflexively opposed to public health measures. Of course we're not. All we're asking for is reasonable processes that allow reasonable input that then allows more proportionate and reasonable measures over time. I just close by saying Japan is an example of a country that really walked away effectively from quite serious emergency powers that it put into place in April, but in September it lifted those powers and has gone back to something like normality in terms of civic freedom. So countries can do this. They can be both tough when needed on the pandemic, but then they can also hold back when needed to allow the civic freedoms that are essential to democracy. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. And I think that emphasis on where we see good practice is one we're going to want to come back to, partly because it's always so easy to criticize governments, but we have to find ways to help governments through this really challenging time. And maybe if I can go to Joe and more or less ask you the same question, Joe, as you see the global landscape in your work, what do you see as the most challenging practices around emergency powers? What concerns you the most as you look around the world and see this extensive, multifaceted, multi-layered use of exceptional legal and political powers by states?
Well, it's always tough to follow Tom because he summarized it extremely well. But I think in simple terms, the biggest fear we have at the Open Government Partnership is that this regression in civil liberties and civic space, which is really a 15-year-long trend that predated the pandemic, both accelerated through the pandemic, as did many other challenges facing our societies, from inequality to gender discrimination and so on, that those will become a permanent erosion. So we were already in a very tough place in terms of democratic backsliding and restrictions on civic space increasing. If we were to have that become a permanent situation where governments were taking the opportunity of COVID to expand their powers, I think that would be very worrying. Of course, it's not all doom and gloom. I think one thing we've learned in OGP, where we have 78 national member governments, is also it's important to give governments credit where they did take unprecedented steps for example, to protect jobs that were under threat from lockdowns and so on, and some of those economic measures. I think it's kind of related in the sense of us ensuring that governments have credit where it's due. But even in our members, which you would think would be the kind of leaders on avoiding the types of steps that Tom outlined, if you go through and look granularly at some of those specifics, we have over a quarter of our countries who still do not have time stamps on when they will end current emergency powers. We have 7 countries that can still rule by decree without proper democratic oversight. We have several where there are still restrictions on what the media can report, and those restrictions have extended beyond COVID to other parts of public life. And of course, there is also a strong link here to corruption. We have systems for example, procuring PPE, which were completely sidelined in favor of contracts to well-connected people, to political parties in power, for example, which again helps to accelerate that erosion of trust and democratic backsliding that predated the pandemic. So I fully agree with this idea that an open approach where civil society and citizens are involved in a dialogue with government about what is appropriate, having parliaments front and centre to provide that oversight, having in place time-limited end dates for any powers that still exist, increasing transparency. Those are all things that practical things we can do and encourage governments to take on board. And my hope is that this is a turning point, right? Again, just to end with this quite gloomy picture of the last decade and a half. If the pandemic has done anything to further shine a light on this erosion of civil liberties and civic space, and some of the political headwinds perhaps are starting to shift, which I'm sure we'll get onto in terms of drawing attention to this issue, then perhaps it can be a turning point.
No, thank you. And I think in that motif of in crisis, there's sometimes opportunity for transformative change is one that I think we want to hold through the reflections we're having this morning. Emily, I'm going to turn to you because really you're in the trenches of the human rights effects of the pandemic. And I wondered if you, again, would share with us what you see as the things that concern you most at the moment, and the risks that you're seeing, and where you think the dangers lie in the human rights space, in particular around the use of exceptional emergency powers up and down the globe.
Thanks so much, Fionnuala, and it's just such a pleasure and an honor to be on a panel with such wonderful partners as you and Tom and Joe. So I'm really happy to be here. I guess first I'd just like to echo a point that Joe made, which is that this really isn't a new phenomenon. We've seen that governments have used emergency powers to entrench their power and to limit dissent for quite some time now. And I think the example of Egypt is really useful in thinking about what's making us worry. Because we saw that the Sisi regime used Egypt's long-standing state of emergency laws to expand and cement his power, and in effect, creating new laws throughout, such as draconian counterterrorism laws, anti-protest laws, NGO laws, that effectively quashed dissent and really clamped down on human rights defenders and journalists. And I think last month, when they rescinded the emergency powers, the reality is that those additional powers have been entrenched in new laws. And so I think the lesson that we're taking and that we are concerned about right now is that very often, even after those emergency powers are rescinded, or let me put it this way, they're a lot harder to remove than they are to put into place. And I think we need to start thinking about what our plan is to remove those and to begin to think about what it looks like to do so in a responsible and time-bound way. And both Joe and Tom spoke a lot about the numbers, so I just won't repeat, but I would say that what we're seeing is that these emergency powers are cutting across all aspects of life. That's, health, administration, elections, criminal justice, and so much more. And so the implications of what the rights that are at stake as a result of these powers is pretty significant. And I think, one example of that is in Malaysia. We saw that the government used its COVID powers to suspend parliament and state legislature, target dissent, and criminalize spreading what you called the quote unquote fake news. And I think, all the while COVID cases climbed, as did deaths. And fortunately in Malaysia, court challenges and activism were successful in pushing for the ending of those emergency powers in August. And in fact, they had successful elections there. But I think it's a reminder that these powers can do a lot to entrench power in other aspects of life. And I would just go on to say that what we also see is that I think, like Tom said, that we appreciate the need to responsibly take care of social distancing and the like, but the way in which association and assemblies have been banned has often meant in some places that it has been used by critics to be able to prevent their opponents from running in elections, and also to go after their supporters. I think we saw that in Uganda last November. And so what we believe is that there needs to be an effort to really think about how do we build responsible efforts at this time that would allow us to limit those, the ability to extend those emergency powers, as well as to ensure that you can have participation in a responsible way. And finally, I would just say on the issue of surveillance, I think one of the challenges that we see is that the uses of what those surveillance powers will do and how they will be helpful for tracking and preventing COVID are important, but on the same time, we've also seen that they're collecting huge amounts of information, often with unclear uses, and sometimes even using things like facial recognition and CCTV to monitor and target folks. And so I just think we really need to think about what is the value of these techno solutions, and are they actually achieving the ends that we hope they are? And do we need to be thinking about ways in which this can be responsibly used, or frankly not used at all? And so I just would also call on us to think in this moment about not just what are we tracking, what these measures have done in order to prevent and contribute to human rights abuses. But I think there's a related point, which is I think we also need to understand how effective they've been in preventing the pandemic, and whether they are appropriate and responsible in the circumstances.
Yeah, no, I think, Emily, so many of those threads are so important. One is, I think, just the long historical view that you've outlined on exceptionality. I think we all, students of the Roman Republic to the present day, and the history of the abuse of emergency powers, and the way in which they really fundamentally are pernicious in legal systems, and they entrench and normalize. And we're seeing so much of that. As you say, Egypt is really an example where you take the word emergency out of the legal lexicon, but it doesn't actually mean that the practice of exceptional powers has really left the room. It just means that it's moved quite elegantly, in a way, into a different space that makes it much harder to dislodge, that makes it harder to remove. And I think it is this normalization of the exception and the rewiring of the systems of governance and the systems of accountability that I think we're all so deeply concerned about. And which brings me really back to Tom. I think, Tom, in May, you wrote an article that was, you said really that it was time for governments to set these concrete plans to really get with the program, start thinking about end rather than than sort of the status quo that we have. And you thought that there was a way, I think, to move from this idea that anything goes, which is the initial response of the kind of exceptional moment, into something that would be, as you've described in your earlier remarks, more modulated, more kind of a step-by-step approach. And so I wonder if you've given us a little bit of information already about countries that you've seen that are making these nascent moves. And so I wonder if you just highlight for us what you see as good practice in this way, but also maybe talk to us a little bit about the barriers to that step-by-step, why we're seeing such a reluctance to move from the wholesale use of exceptional powers to a more retail and modulated use of exceptional powers.
Thank you. I mean, I try to summarize what the three of us have said so far with a really central message that I think the community of organizations and people concerned with civic space need to hone and put forward very clearly, which is if there's a central lesson from the pandemic about governance, is that the most effective governance of the pandemic has been strong bonds of trust between governments and their citizens. Those societies where such bonds of trust are very weak, I have to point to the example of Russia, for example, or a number of Central European countries, are really struggling with the medium and long-term handling of the pandemic because citizens, if they don't trust the government, don't comply with measures, don't get vaccinated, don't comply with other public health measures. And so the objective for governments shouldn't be control, it should be building trust. And how do you build trust with citizens? It's not through drastic restrictions, it's not through blanket bans, it's through transparency, it's through input, through consultation, and so forth. So what we have to say is our interest is in an effective pandemic response. It's not in limiting pandemic responses. It's in making those responses effective. And therefore, governments need to pay laser-like attention to how they can build trust with citizens. And the way they will do that is not through blanket bans, not through states of emergency, and so forth. So I think we really need to clarify our message with ourselves and with others with whom we communicate to really give a clear idea of what is needed here. Now, and I would really say that it's no surprise that bans on public gatherings have been probably the central feature of many government state of emergency response. They just slapped into place right as the pandemic hit, blanket bans on public gatherings, often with curfews and military enforced in some cases. Why is that? It's no coincidence, but that's because prior to the pandemic, the energy in the world around transformational change was coming through public gatherings, protests, social movements that went out into the streets and pushed for transformational change in all kinds of countries around the world. And so just as we saw in the early years of the closing space for civil society that Joe talked about, it's been unfortunately a long path. Much of that was initially targeted at NGOs because governments felt, oh, it's those pesky NGO advocacy groups that are giving us trouble, so we're going to go after those with NGO laws. But then as the energy moved away from formalized civil society to the street, governments have responded by trying to control the street much more. And so the pandemic came right at this moment when protests were really surging in many countries, and government used the pandemic to try to silence them. Think of Algeria as an example of a country that put into place a complete ban on public gatherings at a time when Algeria had been facing roiling protests for some time. And so moving away from these measures is a question of opening up step by step and saying, come on, there is no legitimacy with a complete ban on public gatherings anymore, maybe in the first month or two of the pandemic, but we clearly have knowledge now that that's not necessary. So we need to hone in on those measures that are the most damaging by governments, provide the evidence-based response that shows that they're not necessarily, and really advocate and push hard with the central message that we are trying to improve pandemic responses. We are not trying to limit them. Thanks.
No, I think, Tom, that motif is a really, really important through line. And I think I often find that the argument that it's the right or moral thing to do or the rule of law compliant thing to do, increasingly we find those arguments actually difficult to move with governments. But it does seem to me this kind of harnessing together of a clear line of effectiveness of response and value added is a way in which we can kind of cut through some of the clutter. And it in some ways realigns the way in which human rights and rule of law and transparency actors are able to actually close the gap with governments about similar interests, and I think similar through lines, similar values, similar imperatives, certainly speaking to the needs of I think individuals on the ground. I think also your broader assessment of this, the link between the pre-COVID space, and this is a point I think that we've also seen from Joe very clearly, and the current space. These two things are intrinsically linked, and it is really understanding these broader kind of scalar patterns that really tell us both the scale of the challenge we have, but actually to find clearer ways through it. And Joe, one of those clear way throughs actually may be coming up very quickly. OGP is helping support this summit, and that'll be taking place hosted by South Korea in the next month. And of course, civic space is going to be central to the discussion that you'll be having in that conversation. And we know from multiple organizations, including, for example, Civicus, that civic space is restricted or closed in at least 110 countries around the world. So that's a reality in the conversation. And I guess the question I have for you is, how do you see this summit as a strategic opportunity to engage states on this issue? And really to try to move the needle in the way that Tom's been describing about the misuse, but also the kinds of ways in which progress might be made. And what role do states, including South Korea, have to play in that? So really welcome your thoughts on the sort of strategic opportunity ahead.
It's a great question, and I think the very simple place to start is that we need more governments who will stand up for civic space and prioritize it, right? So to that extent, having South Korea make this one of the main themes of their chairing of the Open Government Partnership and the summit they have coming up is a really good example. And the reason it's interesting is not just because they decided to put this on a summit agenda. Of course, that's, you know, right. Anyone to some extent can do that, but they also have an interesting track record themselves. So if you look at the protest movement that led to the collapse of the previous South Korean government, very much led by citizens and civil society, a lot of dissatisfaction around inequality, state capture and corruption in Korea. What the Moon administration did was seek to harness that citizen energy and turn it into a permanent dialogue where citizens could have a voice in proposing different policies, being involved in decision making. The initiative is called First Street, based on Gwanghwamun Square, and that is in a sense institutionalizing that type of trust building measure that Tom was talking about, and giving that a kind of permanent place for citizens and civil society to have a voice, even in a country which also has its own challenges in terms of polarization and so on. So I think the leadership of Korea domestically and through this summit is interesting. I think the challenge we've had at OGP is, how do you go beyond the argument around the benefits of public participation and citizen engagement as a tool for effective government? I agree with you, that's a really useful line of argument. But how do you extend that to some of these more thorny political civic space issues that we've been discussing? And just to pick up one example that Emily mentioned, which again is a pre-pandemic example, but the digital surveillance of activists in Mexico who are campaigning against the sugar a sugar tax, for a sugar tax, I should say, the misuse of the Pegasus software by individuals who got hold of that software that was supposed to be used on narco traffickers and was instead used on civil society was one of the most egregious examples that we've seen of illegal surveillance. And through OGP, civil society in Mexico and the Mexican government managed to come together and agree a framework for oversight of the surveillance tools that were being misused in this case. Now, again, that's these examples are few and far between, and I'm not saying implementation in any case has been perfect, but I think that it is that type of approach, bringing citizens and civil society together with government, where there might be some potential.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting too is I think the patterns that you're all describing that we see happening at national level are also, of course, also happening in multilateral spaces where it's not just the absence or the constriction of civil society in national settings, but actually that's moving upwards into global spaces where we see the same kinds of processes in play, the restriction of the participation of civil society in global decision-making processes, their exclusion from spaces, the kind of establishment of new spaces, frankly, that states want to avoid, the multilateral spaces where they might actually end up having to meet with and engage civil society actors to change their policy courses, by setting up the select clubs that allow them to do their work in ways that really avoid and further stigmatize and exclude civil society and a broader set of stakeholders. So I think we're facing this on so many levels. Emily, to you, like one of the things that I've been struck by in my work, which is I think really difficult, is the fact that the use of exceptional powers is not just kind of constricted to one set of kind of predictable actors, if you want, but in fact that we see the use of exceptional powers by a whole range of actors. One of the motifs that I have myself in this space is that our friends are not our friends anymore. And so from Paris to other places, we see many governments using these kinds of powers. And so I wonder, can you tell us, because OSF is working across these spaces, both places where you would expect to find restrictions and places, frankly, where we would hope that it's better, but it's in fact much less so. So how is OSF working in these different spaces, and what are you learning in these from the kind of spectrum of challenge that you're seeing, from, quote, established democracies to spaces that are clearly authoritarian, and the commonalities and challenges across them both?
Thanks, Fionnuala. And I think you raise a really important point, which is that first, these are not unique to governments in certain regions or certain kinds of governments, but that we see this kind of use of exceptional powers everywhere where OSF is active. And like I said earlier, once it starts, it's a lot harder to remove them than it is to begin the process of undermining democratic freedoms in this way. And I think as a result, OSF saw the need to connect activists across borders and to build solidarity to reverse the trend. Tom mentioned earlier about the ban on assemblies, and I think what we saw in Thailand was that the combination of national level work and transnational campaigning was successful in getting that ban removed. And so what we decided to do was to support an international campaign around this. And we recognize that each country is different, but the challenges are common. And I mean, to be realistic, governments, especially authoritarian governments, are learning from one another and borrowing these strategies. And so I think in civil society, we need to do the same and learn from what each other is doing, as well as to work together to try and reverse the trend. So I think it's important too, just to note that a piece of that has to be engaging critical international actors and national legislatures and national allies to do this. And I think that's something that both Tom and Joe have spoken about, is the need to really do this together. But maybe to answer your question more directly, Fionnuala, I think that what we feel is missing right now is the political leadership, not only to demonstrate how to rescind these powers, but what it looks like to really renew our commitment to the rights and freedoms that are so critical to effective democratic governance. And so what we're calling for in this campaign are 4 concrete steps that we'd like to see governments put forward. I think first, this is really building on what Tom said earlier. We would love to see governments develop a plan, a roadmap, if you will, for how they're going to rescind and adopt sunset clauses for the emergency powers in a responsible and time-bound fashion, and to do so in consultation with key actors in the country, including civil society. I think second, we want to see governments ensure and just commit to not using these emergency measures to target and silence defenders, civil society advocates, journalists, or other activists that might be at risk. And for those providing foreign aid and security assistance, to really take care not to do so to countries that are using these emergency measures in that way. I think third, we're really keen to see governments review their foreign security and development assistance to ensure that they also provide governments and other governments the tools to rescind these measures and to think about that kind of responsible process that Tom and Joe have alluded to. And finally, and Vanilla, I think this is something you have also called for. We're really keen to see governments enact moratoriums on the sale and transfer of surveillance technology until appropriate human rights safeguards can be put in place. And I think this meeting, the OGP summit, as well as the Summit for Democracies in Washington will all be important places where we can ask governments to step up and make these commitments and then work in partnership with them to implement and monitor them. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I'd say one thing I'm seeing that makes me very positive, and it is reflected in your remarks, is I think the scale of attention. We've had explosions in the use of emergency powers before, including, for example, after 9/11. But I do see a kind of a coalescence of different types of actors coming together. I also see, and I will say clearly supported by OSF and by others, we see this this real attempt to bring lots of voices into the room, groups, stakeholders that are experiencing these challenges, both at the grassroots level, at the intergovernmental level, at the different kinds of stakeholders, to help us create a conversation that really is going to be definite. And I think that's the hope, is that the conversation is so loud that it moves up. And maybe, I mean, I suppose this brings me back, Tom, to another summit. So maybe we're in the era of summits at the moment, and we're thinking about how these pivotal moments really can help shape the kind of leadership that Emily's talking about. How do we really get states to embrace their leadership, their defense of these values? And the Biden administration is going to have its Summit for Democracies. And I think I'm going to ask you to reflect for us on the opportunities you see from that summit, and what kind of things are on the agenda or should be on the agenda of the summit, and how can we get the stakeholders who will be at that summit to focus squarely on this issue as central to some of the foundational values that a Summit for Democracy would seem to be rightly promoting.
Many hopes are being pinned on this summit. I think many civic actors all around the world have viewed it as an opportunity to get their issues, as it were, onto the agenda. It's probably the biggest value of the Summit for Democracy that will be held on December 9th and 10th. It's a major signaling event, signaling that the United States is once again taking seriously democracy and human rights around the world. And that in addition, many, many other democracies are willing to come together and join that signaling and say, we too recognize our own limitations on democracy, the need to improve that, and the need to work together to support democracy globally. Signaling is important in an era in which there are many bad messages and bad narratives being put forward in many places. Now, how to get these specific issues, civic space, really onto the agenda, they're there to some extent. The kinds of issues that are being talked about as the main agenda items on the summit include support for free and independent media, for example, limiting crackdowns crackdowns on social movements is another area. Improving technology for democracy. And so some of the main, there's sort of been 6, 7, 8 agenda items the administration has put forward and says it wants to emphasize, definitely connect to civic freedom. They don't, however, they have a kind of a long-term view built into them. And so what we're going to need to do as a broader community trying to have input in shaping these items is to attach them to the current issues that we're talking about these sort of pandemic-related restrictions, so that there's a specificity. So when we talk about free and independent media, yes, definitely an unquestioned good, but let's talk about the threats to media in this current context. Yes, technology for democracy, very important, but what we mean is Emily mentioned, for example, maybe a moratorium on export of certain surveillance technology and so forth. So we have to be careful that the summit is not just a set of very broad gauge, sort of aspirational agenda items that are not attached to the specific conditions. Then the second thing that will be important is the follow-up to the summit. When countries make commitments at the summit publicly and say, these are the things we intend to do, and we sort of affirm plan to do, as an example of our commitment to democratic reform and to rights, then in the follow-up, the year of action that people are talking about will follow the summit, that civic actors need to have both the space and the knowledge and sort of the organizational capacity to monitor these commitments and hold governments to it and say, you came to this big signaling event, you made these commitments. There's going to be another event a year from now. There is a process here, but that both governments and civic actors will take part in to hold government to these commitments. So it's both shaping the agenda to give it specificity and attachment to the current conditions, and then creating follow-up mechanisms that are meaningful and real and have real teeth to them over time to make use of the commitments that are made.
No, thanks. That's really helpful. And I am really struck, I will say, in my own multiple conversations with many governments on this issue, that I do believe there's an enormous thirst for leadership. There is a kind of a hunger that the signaling, I think the signaling piece is really critical. We've had an absence of sustained, clear signaling on so much of this sort of space of exceptionality. That's also a residue of 20 years of exceptionality in other spaces and the practices at the meta level that you've talked about, Tom. So I think the agenda setting is really, really important, and a belief that it actually sticks, that it's not just sort of bumper stickers at summits, but that there's actually some kinds of concreteness and follow through on it, which I think really brings me back, Joe, to you, because as you know, as we all know, at many of these, whether it's the G7 or the Summit for Democracies, there will be these commitments, as Tom's just said. It matters that they're made. It will be important that they're made. They will be micro-analyzed. But at the same time, the realities on the ground are so stark in so many of the countries that we've been talking about, and the pressure and the exclusion and the choking, and in many cases even the killing of civil society actors and HRDs is just a dense practice and really clear phenomena. And so I guess my question for you is, from when you look at the OGP members and you look at their national action plans, and you think of the kind of vehicles that there are to monitor governments at these various summits, what has your experience taught you about how we can actually generate meaningful commitments, but then actually, as Tom said, how do we implement them? What are our ways to hold those things and make them stick?
Yeah, I mean, as you point out, it's easy enough to come and give a 3-minute speech as a head of state or government with warm words about democracy and civic space. I think, that's not as unfortunately that's not going to lead to the change that we want alone. I agree with Tom that the Summit for Democracy is a great signaling moment. 108 countries have been invited, so it's also a very broad tent. And I think one interesting idea would be to actually see whether countries who over the next year regress further lose their invitation to the second Summit for Democracy at the end of next year. That's I mean, one idea. As far as OGP goes, I think we now have very good data after 10 years of our partnership that when commitments are co-created with civil society and citizens, they are more likely to be implemented. And that is a really important finding for these global summits, because if you just have governments making commitments alone without proper input, we know those are less likely to be ones that are taken forward through implementation. And I think one of the risks which we need to be very careful with is to have governments coming with their own policies and proposals and then just asking civil society to monitor afterwards. Because that, in a way, is just further instrumentalizing civil society, when civil society should actually have a voice in what those commitments are. And I think that's very much our model. I think the question for us all is to, and OGP will actually be launching a civic space network ourselves at our summit to try and bring together a group of governments with organizations like Emily's and Tom's and others to actually have an ongoing dialogue around how we then take these reforms forward. So we have some kind of connective tissue between these big events like the Paris Peace Forum and others, because without that, it's very easy for that progress to kind of slip.
Yeah. No, and I'm so struck by your comments about kind of how we model, like if we're saying to governments, well, we have to model civil society, we have to do this civil society stakeholder inclusion to make these things stick, to have real resonance and that trust building, then actually so many of these sort of elevated spaces also have to model the same kind of practices in a real and meaningful way. Emily, I'm going to go to you for maybe another, I'm thinking about how much time and energy OSF is spending on this issue and elevating it, spending resources and institutional time. And I guess I just want to have you tell us why you're doing that, why you think it's so important to spend that time to see why does this piece of work matter so much in the broadest sense of OSF's vision for an open society?
Thanks, Fionnuala. I mean, the fight for democratic freedoms and to defend against authoritarianism has been sort of at the heart of OSF's work for the last 30 years. It's our bread and butter. But I think we've seen that the headwinds are gaining force and that we have to move swiftly with our allies and adapt and confront these new challenges. And it's our belief that emergency powers really are one of those new forms of threats that we see undermining rights and democracies in all the regions where we work. So when we go and speak to our partners who are in the front lines of these struggles, whether that's journalists in places like Brazil and Honduras, or opposition parties in Myanmar and Thailand, or human rights activists in Egypt and Uganda, and I think you mentioned earlier, like minority and marginalized groups in places like France and Sri Lanka. Time after time, they're pointing us to the use of these emergency powers as a vehicle or as a way to undermine their rights further and to violate democratic rule. And so as a private philanthropy, our roots are really at supporting those national level actors in those struggles. And I think to the point Joe was making, supporting those activists to be ready and able partners as both contributors and monitors to the plans that governments are making to rescind and to sunset these provisions. But even as we continue to do that work, I think we're also a global organization, and we just see how valuable the work is in building momentum across regions, across countries, and giving civil society the potential and opportunity to work together and act, as you said, in these international spaces where they can put reforms, push reforms, and try and make that agenda stick. And I think that's why we've been focusing on this more global campaigning effort, because we see that in places like this meeting and OGP and the Summit for Democracies, and even in places like the negotiations around a pandemic treaty, we see the opportunity to really take on what it means to have responsible democratic government action in response to this kind of pandemic, and how to do so in a way that doesn't undermine democratic freedoms. And so, I mean, not to repeat what we've said already, but I do think the biggest challenge we have right now is getting governments to move beyond the rhetoric and really start talking about how you do this in concrete and practical ways, and to do so in a way where we're building a community of success. And I think that's where we're hoping that we can work together with our civil society partners, but also with governments, to really think about what it looks like for government, philanthropy, civil society to take lessons from the experience we've had to date during COVID and create and implement commitments that will not only end the emergency powers that have been enacted now, but help us think about what it looks like in the future when we have to address these kinds of security or health risks in our societies. Because ultimately, I think our goal is that, to go back to something Tom said earlier, is to help governments succeed in responding to these difficult challenges, but to do so in a way that is responsible and upholds key fundamental and democratic freedoms that we think are so important for democracies.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience, which is always good. It means that our conversation has stimulated people to think about the question. And one of the questions that's come in is a question that asks that the impact of emergency powers has not fallen equally, meaning that some communities are more likely than other communities to have been targeted by emergency powers, and that the fault lines of the use of emergency powers really have been falling across historically marginalized groups, whether on the basis of economic or social status, whether on the basis of their minority status within communities. And so the question has been, how do you convince governments who've had really difficult relationships with certain communities and are using those powers in a way in line with those historically difficult, how do you unwind that? And maybe, Emily, I think that question might go to you, but I'd welcome Tom or Joe's thoughts on that question too.
Thanks, Fionnuala. I mean, ultimately, I think you're right. It's hard to, precisely because emergency powers expand government power and do so in ways that can often extend into all parts of life. I think that's one of the reasons why we're particularly concerned about them, because in these moments, then they can be used to target certain communities. And what we have seen, as the question notes, is that across countries around the world, we have seen a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. And I think that's where civil society can play a role, because I think engaging together and thinking about what those responses are and how we can get back to those upholding those democratic freedoms, even as we respond to the pandemic, is something where, by bringing in the stakeholders from the communities to be part of the conversation and really hearing how they think that they need to address the situation, I think will also help to improve and build strong relationships. In fact, in some regards, this is an opportunity to really engage with those communities in a way that the governments haven't in the past, and to create a new opportunity for a conversation. But the reality is the emergency powers don't help that, because what they end up doing is often contributing to the distrust between different communities. Thanks.
Yeah. I think that point is well made. There's also often a double layer for so many communities. They're often the communities that are the hardest hit by the pandemic, meaning the racial and ethnic lines that have so devastated certain communities by the impact of the health pandemic itself, then overlap and are compounded by emergency power practiced by the state against that same community that is really double burdened. I see, Tom, you were going to add something there.
Well, it was on that very, very point, is that, again, to put the issue in terms that governments will see as in their self-interest, we have to say that the marginalized communities that are in many cases being hit the hardest, both by the pandemic itself, but also by the emergency measures. I think, for example, of in India, some of the inequalities between Muslims and the rest of the society, which has been heightened by the pandemic and the pandemic response in various ways, we have to point out that it is those marginalized communities in many places that are vectors for the virus because of the conditions in which they live and because of the lack of adequate public health services. Or think, for example, in Singapore, the experience of where the virus surged in Singapore and some of the less advantaged communities in Singapore. And so again, we have to say we're not, yes, we believe in the right of equality and non-discrimination as a general principle, but also as an approach of better effectiveness in dealing with the pandemic, is that marginalized people contribute to your pandemic problem, both in the conditions they live in and the way you're treating them. So again, it's self-interest, not just principle.
Yeah. No, that point is really well made. Another question, which I think actually, Joe, probably goes to you, is the question, it says, you know, many governments are afraid. They're afraid because they are concerned they can't manage the pandemic well, and many of them have not managed the pandemic well. And the negative incentives of letting go of the thing that seems to help you manage the pandemic are really high. How do you respond to the fear that many governments have in this moment of letting go of power when they are often feeling really disabled and disheartened by their capacities to manage the pandemic?
Well, I mean, sitting here in the UK, I can say that if you take the example I used earlier on procurement, it's causing the government a massive political problem by the fact that they continue to have a huge issue in terms of effective procurement on medical supplies, and more contracts are being revealed, and more political connections with people that got those contracts. So that is a political problem, and I think as these sorts of things are revealed, that will happen in many other places as well. So I kind of like Tom's framing of thinking about not just principle but self-interest, and I think a lot of these governments who rode out the pandemic did have that initial kind of spike in trust when citizens felt very reliant, obviously, on governments to protect lives and livelihoods. But that phase will come to an end. There will be an accountability and reckoning, and that is the next phase. So I think, you know, if your self-interest is to stay in power, I think actually having a frank discussion about what we've learned about emergency powers through the pandemic, how they can be better oversight in the future, how they can be more proportionate in the future, could be in the self-interest of some governments who will come up shortly for elections.
So we have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to do the TED Talk 1 minute, your one thing that we think we should be telling governments to do as we close out at a hard stop in about 3 minutes. And maybe we'll go the way we started. Tom, 1 minute, the one thing you think we should be doing to address emergency powers that we can do right now.
Well, I guess I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I guess because I believe it very strongly, and I don't think the message has come through strongly enough, is that the rights community, those who care about civic space, we're not trying to limit government's approach to the pandemic. We're trying to help them. And that good governance, in a deeper sense, again and again in the world, has been shown to be not just a question of certain policies, but above all of a productive, healthy, open, and transparent relationship between governments and citizens. The pandemic has heightened that insight, heightened that realization, and heightened that imperative. And so the interests here merge, they don't diverge. That would be my central message.
Joe, 1 minute. Your solution.
Going back to the summits, one very practical, concrete thing I would like to see is that every government that has been invited to the Summit for Democracy, that's 108, or the OGP Summit, that's 78, if each of those governments were to come forward with one practical reform to open civic space and roll back some of these emergency powers, and to give it a time frame of the second Summit for Democracy to show some results around implementing that, I think that would be a kind of strong message to send, that this is actually a global norm we want to see.
Emily, you're going to close us out. What would be your one recommendation in the last minute of our session?
Thanks, Finn. And since Joe and Tom have already done a great job of setting me up, I'll just say I think that we need to create a renewed commitment to those democratic freedoms that are so essential to the kind of trust and effective governance that will allow us to navigate our way out of the pandemic. And I think we do that by coming forward with the kind of concrete recommendations that Joe talked about, but also ensuring that we're not using those emergency powers to go after human rights defenders, to go after civil society, or to go after our journalists or critics. And so I think right now my ask would be that we stop using any of the powers we do have immediately against those who are our critics and who are standing up to represent the communities that these governments represent. Thank you.
Thank you all. I hope people are listening. I think we have an extraordinary wealth of both practical and visionary knowledge in our session today. Thank you all. Thanks those of you who joined us for this session. We are now officially closed right on time, and we look forward to all the summits ahead where some of these suggestions we hope will be translated into a concrete reality. Thank you all very much.